what would you do if the answer to your deepest miseries arrived in a stained 15-year-old envelope? Clara Jenkins thought it was just another final notice. Instead, sliding out from the yellowed paper was a heavy brass key and a confession that proved her entire life of poverty was a lie. The rain in Seattle had a way of seeping into your bones, but for Clara Jenkins the cold was something she had long grown accustomed to. At 32, Clara's life was a meticulously balanced equation of underpaid labor and mounting debt. She worked split shifts at a greasy diner downtown, coming home smelling of stale coffee and fryer oil, only to sit at her cramped kitchen table and shuffle past due bills like a deck of cursed tarot cards. It was a dreary Tuesday afternoon when the knock came. Clara froze, her heart hammering a familiar rhythm of panic against her ribs. She was 3 weeks behind on rent, and her landlord, Mr. Henderson, possessed a terrifying punctuality. She crept to the peephole. It wasn't Henderson. It was Gary, the neighborhood postal worker, looking thoroughly miserable under his dripping rain slicker. He was holding a scanner and a plastic sleeve. Clara cracked the door open. "Gary? I don't have any packages coming." "Certified mail, Clara. Needs a signature," Gary mumbled, handing her the electronic pad. "Looks ancient, to be honest. Got caught in the dead letter office in Chicago for over a decade, from the looks of the stamps." Frowning, Clara scribbled her name and took the plastic sleeve. Inside was a thick, manila envelope. The paper was heavily oxidized, turning a sickly yellow-brown at the edges, and it smelled faintly of cigar smoke and mildew. The postage marks were a chaotic mess of red ink, but the date stamped in the top right corner made the breath hitch in her throat. October 14, 2011. 15 years ago. She closed the door, her hands trembling slightly, and carried the envelope to her rickety table. The return address was handwritten in an elegant, sweeping script that belonged to a bygone era. Tyler 402 Ashwood Lane, Portland, Oregon. Clara dropped the envelope as if it had burned her. Abernathy. That was her father's real surname. James Abernathy had legally changed his name to Jenkins before Clara was even born, severing all ties with his family. He had been a quiet, deeply sad man who worked himself into an early grave on a construction site when Clara was just 14. He never spoke of his brother, Lionel. He never spoke of Portland. All Clara knew was that her father had walked away from something toxic, choosing a life of agonizing poverty over whatever darkness the Abernathy family held. And now a voice from that darkness was sitting on her kitchen table. Her fingers numb, Clara tore the top of the envelope open. A heavy object slid out, clattering loudly against the faux wood laminate of the table. It was an antique brass key, intricately carved, its teeth worn smooth with use. Attached to it was a faded silk ribbon. Following the key was a stack of thick, textured stationery, filled with the same sweeping handwriting. Clara smoothed the pages out, her eyes scanning the ink. "To my niece, Clara, if this letter has found you, then my lawyers have executed my final, secret will, and I am dead. I suspect your father, James, has filled your head with stories of my greed. He was right to do so. I was a monster to him, but a dying man finds little comfort in his money, and even less in his pride. I write this knowing I have weeks left. The cancer has spread. My business partners, the vultures circling my estate, believe they have won. They believe they have legally stripped me of everything, preparing to liquidate the Abernathy holdings and erase our name. They have stolen what should rightfully belong to you and James. But I did not leave them everything. Your father chose a life of hardship to protect you from the rot of our family's wealth. But nobody deserves to starve while thieves feast. The key enclosed belongs to the cellar door of the old Hawthorne property on Macadam Avenue. The estate has been tied up in probate, left to rot. They never searched the foundations. They never knew about the hollow behind the wine racks. Go to Portland, Clara. Go alone. What is hidden there will not only secure your future, but it will expose the fraud that ruined your father. It is your inheritance. It is your vengeance. Forgive me if you can. Uncle Lionel. Clara read the letter 3 times. The words blurred together as tears pricked her eyes. Her father's ruined hands, his coughing fits in the middle of the night, the way he would skip dinner so she could eat all of it, flashed before her. He had lived and died in squalor while his family had millions, and someone had stolen it. She picked up the brass key. It was cold and heavy. This wasn't just money. This was justice. She grabbed her cheap flip phone and dialed her co-worker Brenda. Brenda, I need to take your shifts for the rest of the week. No, I'm not sick. I have to go out of town. Clara, are you crazy? Brenda's voice crackled over the line. If you miss Friday, the manager is going to fire you. You can't afford to lose this job. If I don't go, Clara whispered, staring at the letter, I'll be working at that diner until I die, just like my dad did at the site. I have to go. She had exactly $47 in her checking account. It was just enough for a round-trip Greyhound ticket to Portland. She packed a single duffel bag, wrapped the key in a sock, and walked out into the Seattle rain, leaving her eviction notices on the kitchen table. The bus ride down the I-5 corridor felt like a descent into the underworld. Clara barely slept, her mind spinning with a chaotic mix of hope and terror. What if the property had already been torn down? 15 years was an eternity in real estate. What if the hollow behind the wine racks was empty, raided by squatters or urban explorers? She arrived in Portland just as the late afternoon sun was beginning to dip below the tree line, casting long, bruised shadows across the city. She took a city bus to Macadam Avenue, a winding road bordered by steep hills and old wealth. Climbing the Hawthorne property wasn't difficult. It was the only house on the block that looked like a corpse. It was a sprawling Victorian monstrosity set far back from the road, suffocated by decades of overgrown ivy and blackberry brambles. The windows were boarded up with rotting plywood, and the iron gates at the driveway were chained shut, bearing heavy red "No Trespassing" signs. But what made Clara's stomach drop was the heavy machinery parked on the adjacent lot. A bulldozer and a massive excavator sat idle, bearing the logo Cameron Hayes Development. A shiny silver pickup truck was parked near the chained gate, and a man in a tailored suit and a hard hat was standing on the sidewalk, pointing at the roofline while talking loudly on his cell phone. Clara ducked behind a thick cluster of oak trees across the street. "I don't care about the Historical Society's injunction," the man snapped into his phone. "The demolition starts Monday morning. The Abernathy estate has been cleared of all probate holds. We rip it down, we pour the concrete, and we start framing the condos by next month. Just get the crew ready." Clara's blood ran cold. Monday. She had exactly 3 days before Uncle Lionel's secret was buried under thousands of tons of concrete and luxury apartments. She couldn't walk through the front gate now. She had to wait for nightfall. For 4 hours, Clara sat on a damp bench down the street, nursing a cheap coffee and watching the developer finally drive away. When the streetlights hummed to life, casting an eerie orange glow over the damp pavement, she made her move. She slipped through a gap in the rusted iron fencing at the rear of the property. The grounds were a treacherous jungle of thorny bushes and hidden sinkholes. The house loomed above her like a decaying beast, the wind whistling through the gaps in the boards. Lionel's letter had mentioned the cellar door. Clara circled to the back of the house, using the tiny flashlight on her keychain to cut through the oppressive darkness. Beneath a collapsing wooden veranda she found it, a set of slanted iron cellar doors, half buried under a mountain of wet leaves. She dug furiously with her bare hands, tearing her cuticles until the iron handles were exposed. There was a heavy, rusted padlock securing the latch. Clara pulled the brass key from her pocket. It looked too delicate, too antique to open such a brutal industrial lock. With shaking hands, she slipped the key into the keyhole. It resisted at first. Kara held her breath, applying pressure. With a harsh, grinding click, the internal tumblers gave way. The lock popped open. A wave of adrenaline hit her. She heaved the heavy iron doors upward. They shrieked in protest, echoing loudly into the quiet night. Clara froze, waiting for sirens, but the street remained silent. She turned on her phone's flashlight and descended the crumbling stone stairs into the abyss. The cellar smelled of earth, decay, and stagnant water. The air was so thick it was hard to breathe. Clara swept her light across the room. It was massive, supported by heavy wooden pillars. And there, against the far wall, just as the letter promised, were the wine racks. They stretched from floor to ceiling, empty and covered in thick webs. Clara walked over, her boots crunching on broken glass. The hollow behind the racks. She started pulling at the wooden lattice. The wood was so rotten it broke apart in her hands like wet cardboard. She cleared a large section, revealing the damp brick foundation wall behind it. She ran her hands over the bricks. Cold, rough, solid, panic began to set in. Was it a lie, the ramblings of a dying man? She pressed her weight against the wall, moving stone by stone. Suddenly, near the floor, a cluster of bricks shifted inward with a harsh scrape. Clara dropped to her knees. She pushed harder, and an entire 2-foot section of the masonry slid back on hidden, rusted tracks, revealing a dark, square cavity. Inside sat a dark mahogany lockbox reinforced with steel bands. It was incredibly heavy, but Clara dragged it out onto the dirt floor. The box wasn't locked, it had a simple brass latch. She threw it open, expecting to see stacks of gold or banded cash. Instead, the box was stuffed with paper. Tara's heart sank. She pulled out the top stack. They were legal documents, yellowed and crisp. But as she read the headings, her disappointment morphed into pure shock. They were corporate ledgers for Abernathy Global, her family's former shipping empire. But there were red lines drawn through accounts, handwritten notes in Lionel script pointing out massive discrepancies. Beneath the ledgers was a signed contract dated 20 years ago. It was an agreement to intentionally tank the company's stocks, force a bankruptcy, and siphon the assets into offshore accounts. And the signatures at the bottom? One belonged to Lionel Abernathy. The other belonged to Cameron Hayes, the father of the developer she had seen outside today. They had colluded to steal everything, leaving Clara's father a minor shareholder with nothing but debt. But that wasn't the worst of it. At the bottom of the box was a smaller, sealed envelope with Clara's father's name on it. She tore it open. It was a birth certificate. Mother, unknown. Father, James Abernathy. Child, Clara Abernathy. Attached to it was a life insurance policy, taken out on her father, worth $5 million. The primary beneficiary wasn't Clara. It was a trust controlled entirely by Cameron Hayes. Her father hadn't just died of exhaustion. He had been a walking payday, and his death had funded the very development company that was about to tear this house down. Clara sat in the dirt, the papers shaking in her hands. Her entire life, the hunger, the eviction notices, the freezing nights, wasn't just bad luck. It was a calculated crime. The money hadn't vanished. It had been stolen by the very men pretending to be legitimate businessmen upstairs. She had the proof. She had the leverage to destroy them and take back her life. She hurriedly began stuffing the documents into her duffel bag. She needed to get to the police. She needed to find a lawyer. Suddenly, the beam of her flashlight flickered. Above her, the agonizing screech of rusted metal echoed through the damp air. The heavy iron cellar doors were closing. Clara dropped the bag and sprinted for the stairs. "Hey, wait! I'm down here." Slam. The doors crashed shut, plunging the cellar into absolute pitch-black darkness. Clara scrambled up the stone steps, slamming her fists against the underside of the iron doors. She pushed with all her might, but they wouldn't budge. Then, through the thick metal, she heard the chilling, unmistakable sound of a heavy chain being dragged across the handles, followed by the definitive click of a new padlock snapping shut. Footsteps retreated up the wooden veranda above. Clara was trapped in the dark, buried alive with the ghosts of her family's past, and Monday morning's demolition was only 3 days away. The darkness in the cellar was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed against Clara's eyes. For a long, agonizing minute she stood paralyzed on the stone steps, her lungs burning as she forgot to breathe. The air already felt thinner, choked with dust, disturbed by the slamming of the iron doors. "Help! Up, lad," she screamed, pounding her fists against the cold, rusted metal. "Please, is anyone there?" Her voice bounced off the brick walls, swallowed by the vast, empty cavern of the basement. She pressed her ear to the iron. Silence. Whoever had locked her, and whether it was a security guard doing a blind sweep or Cameron Hayes himself, returning to secure his stolen prize, was gone. Clara stumbled backward, her boot slipping on the slick stone. She hit the dirt floor hard, her breath coming in jagged, terrified gasps. "I'm going to die down here," she thought, a cold spike of panic piercing her chest. "I found the truth, and it's going to be my tomb." Her hand brushed against the canvas of her duffel bag. The documents, the proof, the Madeleine stolen from her father. Anger, hot and bright, flared through her veins, pushing back the paralyzing grip of fear. She had not survived 32 years of scraping by, of watching her father work his fingers to the bone, just to be buried under a luxury condominium complex. Clara pulled her phone from her pocket. No service, of course. The battery icon blinked angrily in the red 8%. She turned on the flashlight function, the weak LED beam slicing through the gloom. She had to find another way out. She swept the light across the cellar. The brick walls were solid, the wooden support beams thick and unyielding. She moved past the dismantled wine rack, searching the perimeter. Spiders scattered away from the light, vanishing into cracks in the mortar. Then, in the far back corner, hidden behind a rotting stack of wooden pallets, she saw it, a small rusted iron door set high into the brick wall near the ceiling. A coal chute. Clara dragged a heavy wooden pallet to the wall, ignoring the splinters biting into her palms. She climbed up, her hands trembling as she reached for the chute's latch. It was crusted over with decades of oxidation. She pulled, but it wouldn't budge. "Come on," she gritted through her teeth. She grabbed a loose, heavy brick from the dismantled hollow and brought it down on the rusted latch. Clang. The sound was deafening. She hit it again and again. On the fourth strike, the brittle iron shattered. Clara pushed the metal flap upward. A tiny sliver of moonlight filtered through a thick screen of dead leaves and mud. The chute was agonizingly narrow, a sloping tunnel of rough corrugated steel designed for sliding coal, not for a grown woman. Her phone battery died, plunging her back into darkness. It was now or never. Clara slung the strap of her duffel bag across her chest, securing the documents tightly against her back. She reached up, grabbed the edges of the chute, and pulled herself into the narrow opening. The mud was ubiquitous. The mud was the first thing she truly noticed. The smell of damp earth and ancient soot filled her nose. She kicked her legs, pushing herself upward blindly. The chute grew tighter. Panic seized her throat as her chest wedged against the cold steel. She was stuck. She couldn't move forward, and sliding back meant returning to the tomb. "Think of Dad," she told herself, tears mixing with the sweat and soot on her face. Think of Cameron Hayes laughing. She exhaled entirely, collapsing her ribcage, and shimmied violently. The heavy canvas of her jacket tore, metal scraping against her skin, but she broke free of the bottleneck. A moment later, her hands burst through the wet leaves and grabbed the muddy roots of a blackberry bush. With one final, desperate heave, Clara pulled herself out of the chute and collapsed onto the rain-soaked lawn of the estate. She lay there for 10 minutes, staring up at the dark Portland sky, letting the cold rain wash the dirt from her face. She was bruised, bleeding, and exhausted. But she was free, and she was armed. By Saturday morning, Clara had found a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city. She spent the night carefully drying the damp ledger pages on the radiator. In the harsh daylight, the depth of the betrayal was staggering. The documents detailed dummy corporations, offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, and a systematic, purposeful destruction of Abernathy Global. She needed a lawyer, but not just any lawyer. Going to a high-powered corporate firm was too dangerous. Cameron Hayes was a titan in Portland's real estate scene, and his reach was vast. She needed someone hungry, someone who hated bullies. A frantic search at a local internet cafe led her to Bradley Stone. His office was located above a failing bail bondsman shop in a strip mall. His website was outdated, but his reviews spoke of a bulldog litigator who specialized in representing tenants against abusive landlords and small businesses against corporate takeovers. When Clara walked into his cluttered office, Bradley was nursing a lukewarm coffee surrounded by towering stacks of case files. He looked up, his eyes bags heavy and dark. "We're closed on Saturdays," he grunted, not looking out from his paperwork. "I have $5 million in stolen life insurance and a 15-year-old corporate fraud case involving Cameron Hayes," Clara said, her voice deadpan. "Are you open now?" Bradley stopped writing. He slowly raised his head, eyeing Clara's torn jacket and the soot still clinging to her hairline. "Take a seat." For 2 hours, Bradley Stone sat in absolute silence, reading through the contents of the mahogany box. He scrutinized the ledgers, verified the signatures against public records online, and stared at Clara's birth certificate. When he finally looked up, his expression had shifted from skepticism to pure, unadulterated shock. "Hayes isn't just a white-collar criminal," Bradley whispered, tapping the life insurance policy. "This is a masterpiece of malice. He legally erased your father, bankrupted the family, and used your dad's death as the seed money to build his entire real estate empire. Every condo, every shopping center Hayes owns. It was built on your family's graveyard." "It's tearing the house down on Monday morning," Clara said, her voice tight. "The cellar, the hidden tracks behind the bricks, the physical evidence of my uncle's confession will be turned into dust." Bradley jumped up, knocking his chair backward. "Not if I have anything to say about it. We have 48 hours to draft an emergency injunction." "But Clara, if we miss this window and that house comes down, these papers are just words against a billionaire. We need a judge to halt the demolition, and we need the FBI to raid Hayes' offices before he realizes you escaped that cellar." The war had officially begun. Monday morning arrived with a brutal, clear chill. At 7 a.m., Clara and Bradley were pacing the marble floors of the Multnomah County Courthouse. Bradley had called in every favor he had to secure a 5-minute emergency hearing with Judge Peterson, a notoriously strict but fair magistrate. At 7:45 a.m., the doors to chambers swung open. Bradley burst out, his face flushed, clutching a piece of paper bearing a fresh, wet signature and the heavy stamp of the county court. "We got it," he breathed, grabbing Clara's arm. "Drive. Now." 10 miles away on Macadam Avenue, the scene was a symphony of destruction. Yellow dump trucks lined the street. A massive excavator with a crushing claw sat idling on the front lawn, its treads tearing up the overgrown grass. Standing near the chained gate, wearing a custom-tailored suit and a pristine white hard hat, was Cameron Hayes. He looked at his gold watch, smiling a predatory smile. He had driven out Saturday night, finding the cellar padlock broken. He hadn't bothered to look inside. He simply threw a new heavy-duty chain around the iron doors and locked it. Whoever the trespassing rat was, they were about to become part of the foundation. "All right, boys," Hayes shouted over the roar of the diesel engines, signaling to the foreman. "Tear this eyesore down. Start with the rear foundation. Crush it deep." The excavator lurched forward, its hydraulic arm racing the massive steel claw into the air, aiming directly for the back of the Victorian house right above the cellar. Tires squealed in the distance. A beat-up sedan jumped the curbs, skidding to a halt mere feet from the dump trucks. Bradley Stone threw his door open, sprinting toward the gates, waving the white legal document furiously in the air. "Stop the machines," Bradley roared, his voice cracking. "Shut them down. Court order." Stop the demolition. The foreman, spotting the lawyer and the official paper, panicked and hit the air horn. The excavator's arm froze in midair, a shadow looming over the rotting roof. Cameron Hayes' smile vanished. He stormed toward the gate. "What the hell is this?" "Who are you? This is private property." "Not anymore, Mr. Hayes," Bradley said, slapping the injunction against the billionaire's chest. "Emergency halt of demolition, pending a federal investigation into the property's probate clearance." Hayes laughed, a sharp barking sound. "Federal investigation? You ambulance chaser, I have a team of lawyers who will have this thrown out in 10 minutes. I own this estate." "Actually," a voice said. Clara stepped out from behind Bradley. She was wearing a clean blazer she'd bought at a thrift store, her posture straight, her eyes locked onto the man who had ruined her father's life. Hayes looked at her. Recognition flickered in his eyes, not of her but of the bone structure, the sharp jawline that mirrored the man he had betrayed decades ago. "Actually, you don't own it," Clara said, her voice ringing clear over the idling engines. "My name is Tara Abernathy. James Abernathy was my father. Lionel was my uncle." All the color drained from Cameron Hayes' face. He looked at the house, then back at Clara, his eyes dropping to the thick manila envelope tucked under her arm. "I know what you did, Cameron." Clara stepped closer, the iron gate separating them. "I know about the engineered bankruptcy. I know about the offshore accounts. I know about the $5 million life insurance policy you cashed in when my father worked himself to death. And I know you tried to bury me alive in that cellar on Saturday night." Hayes stumbled backward, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. That's impossible. Those records were destroyed. Uncle Lionel kept receipts," Bradley said with a grim smile. "And right now the FBI is executing a search warrant on your corporate headquarters downtown. They're matching the account numbers we provided them from the 2011 ledgers." The sound of distant sirens began to wail, growing louder as they wound their way up Macadam Avenue. Hayes looked around wildly, realizing he was trapped. His empire, built on a foundation of lies and blood money, was crumbling faster than the rotting house behind him. He didn't say a word. He just stared at Clara, defeated by a ghost he thought he had buried 15 years ago. When the police cruisers pulled up, lights flashing, Hayes didn't resist. He was placed in handcuffs and driven away, his pristine white hard hat left rolling in the mud. 6 months later, the legal battles were still raging, but the outcome was inevitable. The courts froze Cameron Hayes' assets, and the paper trail was undeniable. Clara was officially recognized as the sole surviving heir to the Abernathy estate. She stood on the balcony of a beautiful high-rise apartment overlooking the Seattle skyline. The rain was falling just as it had on the day the envelope arrived, but she was no longer cold. She held a framed photograph of her father, James. He looked tired in the picture, dressed in his stained work clothes, but he was smiling at her. Clara traced the glass over his face. "We did it, Dad," she whispered into the cool evening air. "We finally got what was ours. The debt was paid, the past was unearthed. And Clara Abernathy, no longer a victim of a forgotten life, was finally ready to live." Did Clara's incredible journey from poverty to reclaiming her stolen family fortune leave you breathless? Real life is often wilder than fiction. If you loved this story of vengeance, justice, and hidden secrets, hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more unbelievable true life drama. Drop a comment below. What would you have done if you found that key? See you next time.